This is a new Garrison Commander review. With the newest Archer releases, we got 2 new Archers, both of which having a very unique kit, and one of which is a Garrison. So since we are a Garrison-based channel, we're going to be covering him first. So in today's video, we're going to be covering skills, talents, pairings, and where I think he's going to fit in the very, very packed Garrison meta. Without further ado, let's get started. First, let's talk skills, and there is a ton to unpack here, so let's get right to it. The active skill is a 10-second buff. Wherever this commander heals a target, they deal 80% of the heal strength as true damage to up to 5 nearby enemy troops. And then it has the standard damage reduction down to up to 50%. That troop is also mighty healed for a large portion, 1400, of wounded units. Note that there's no expertise here to boost the active, so keep that in mind as well. Some other things to remember is that true damage is not affected by the attacking troops' attack attribute or the defending troops' defense attribute. This means you're ignoring defense, which is great to counter infantry because most of infantry's gear is based around defense. So you get to negate a pretty heavy portion of your counter's basic buff stat from gear. The other thing though is that heal strength is equal to how many units you're capable of healing, not how many are actually healing. So it doesn't mean that you're going to be dealing less damage when you have fewer wounded units to heal. It's a little strange and it's kind of complex, but at a base level, it's going to be steady as far as damage goes. The other thing to mention is that while true damage itself isn't affected by your own attack, the percentage is affected by the troop's attack. So that's something to keep in mind. So attack isn't completely useless. So that's something to keep in mind, and you're not going to be completely losing the effectiveness of KvK tech, for example, that's all attack. Second, we have a 30% defense and 5% march speed bonus to archers. And if you contain only archers, you deal 10% more normal damage. 30% defense is pretty good, but if true damage becomes more of a thing, this is essentially a moot skill if you're not running pure archers. So for the likes of Hera, you're not going to gain as much as you would if you were running a full archer defense here. The third skill is a 20% less normal damage taken, and if the commander is serving as a garrison commander, you have a 20% chance to negate all current health and defense buffs on your target for the next 5 seconds. This doesn't appear to have a cooldown either, but this has a great potential, if nothing else, for the fact that 20% normal damage is essentially 2/3 of a Hera expertise. So if you pair the two of them together, which I'll get into later, you'll have a lot of normal damage reduction. The fourth skill is if the current target of the commander's troop is a rallied army, you gain 45% increased healing, and whenever this commander uses an active skill, the target loses 10% health, which can stack up to 5 times, meaning you can get up to 50% health reduction, which is massive. There is some counters to this, just judged by the fact that, for example, William Wallace can remove those debuffs, but overall it is potentially very potent. And it's something that does counter some of the other non-cleansing rallies. Lastly, of course, the expertise deals 25% more counterattack damage, and then it goes up to 40% if the target has fewer units than your troop. So that's something to keep in mind if you're being swarmed. It's going to hurt a lot more because you're dealing 40% more counterattack damage instead of just 25, although 25 is still excellent on its own right. Overall, this kit is very loaded on the normal damage side, and it's the closest thing to a normal damage archer that we have. It is very impressive. I am very pleased with the normal damage reduction, and I'm going to get into that more in the pairing section, but it gives some great options for you. Next, let's talk about talents. And really, this is probably the glaring weak point of this commander, is that you have archer, garrison, defense. The defense tree is very weak, and the archer tree is fairly meh overall, so you really do lose out on a lot when you have this as your primary. So that's something to keep in mind as well as you're building your pairs. Overall, for the garrison tree, I go for the standard 3 Garrison investments you'll see me always invest in because they're just great value. For the archer tree, I go to Venomous Sting because you get 8% more skill damage. Although, with it being true damage, you're only benefiting your secondary commander, so keep that in mind if you are planning on doubling up on the true damage. You won't want to go to here. You could maybe go to Phoenix Tail Arrows, but it's still not very good. There's just not a lot of great talents here, and that's, again, a big issue. So, if you have a skill damage based one, Venomous Sting. If not, you really probably want to go back to even down to these 2 talents here, and you'll want to reinvest these 9 talent points somewhere else. Usually you do that in the blue tree, but as we mentioned, the defense tree is pretty weak. This is what I went with overall. You could go up to Testudo with 6 and then get 3 out of 3 in balance, but overall it's just a little bit of a sacrifice, and Testudo is still not the most broken thing. You get a 5% damage reduction for 1 second when you launch a basic attack. It is beneficial while you're being swarmed, but really it's kind of weak. So overall, if you're going with the skill damage based, you want to go with this setup. If you have a secondary commander that's skill damage based, and if you do not, you want to go 3 out of 3 here and 3 out of 3 here, and then come back to these 2 talents and leave this upper area completely open. Next, let's talk formations. And for most people, circle formation is going to be the formation for this commander and the other new archer commander. The 5% boost to healing is great for a healing commander, but it also then boosts the damage you deal, both indirectly because you have more troops, and then directly as well because you are gaining more true damage based on the amount you can heal. So keep that in mind. You do have some alternative options depending on what your secondary is. Testudo is another one you could use here. 5% damage while shielded. And all healing received increased by 2.5%. This is a great one if you're using a shielding and a healing commander. So if you pair this commander with Hera, for example, this would probably be your ideal because you get benefits on both your commander pairs. Some alternatives I see as possible is Arch. If you are looking to do more normal damage, it'll help your counterattacks, which helps resist Swarm. It'll help your normal damage if you're going full archers and you want to make more benefit of that second skill. And it'll just help you stay alive a little more consistently. However, it's secondary to Circle and Testudo. Lastly, if you're really committed to the shielding and you have a secondary commander like Hera, Hollow Square is another option. But overall, Circle should probably be your first priority. Testudo should be your second if you're using a shielding commander with him. And then everything else is kind of behind those 2 options. Alright, now let's get down to pairings. And really, you have 2 different ways you want to approach this commander. You can go full archers to make use of his second skill, or you can go full mixed units and maximize the bonuses of the leadership garrisons, because he doesn't lose a whole lot from having just simply archers. So, first let's talk about the pure archer options. Dido is the most obvious of those options. She has the support tree, which is stellar, while still having the garrison. If you use all archers, you gain 10% less normal damage taken, which when paired with his skill here, becomes 30% less normal damage. That is significant because you have the same amount of reduced normal damage taken as Hera's expertise. So that is an important bar to cross. So that means he can very well be paired with Dido and get good results. Additionally, you have a debuff here that prevents any benefit effects triggered by being surrounded to help counteract those cavalry commanders, as well as the fact that you have a damage reduction and some good health to help bolster his overall survivability. Alternatively, Liang is another popular option that you can look into because he does have a lot of good damage, a good AoE, but you'll want to have this commander primary first because he has the garrison tree, and even though the defense tree is weaker than the skill tree, that garrison tree is really where most of your good garrison talents are. Alternatively, if you want to go with a leadership garrison, you have some options. Hera is, of course, the easy one to go with because you have 30% less normal damage with 3 unit types, and while you lose 10% normal damage dealt, you also have 20% less normal damage here. which means you can have 50% reduced normal damage taken. That means every swarmer and the primary damage they deal, that normal damage, is reduced by 50%. Tack on the fact that you're dealing an additional 40% counterattack damage to people who have less units than you, and this is probably the most swarm resistant garrison in the game. If it isn't, it is very well close to it. That's without considering the shielding, the healing, and any of the other bonuses that they both have in a very loaded kit. The only real issue here is that true damage here and skill damage here mean that you have some conflicting damage sources, but individually they deal enough damage without a bunch of bonuses that it's not a huge downside. Lapu's another option too. I'm not as big on Lapu just because he doesn't have as much that benefits the normal damage resistance, and he's not as swarm resistant. So he's more of a city defense option. If you're running a city defense that's mixed, you can pair these two commanders together. But really, the big three you're going to see are Dido, Hera, and Liang overall. And Hera is probably going to be the one you see most of all, just because that 50% normal damage reduction is absolutely insane. Lastly, let's talk about meta fits. And this is really the tough thing to see without a lot of data to support one way or the other. The healing is unique. It is interesting. It's going to be interesting to see how it turns out, how much percentage is affected by troop attack in terms of the true damage there versus what you would get if it were just directly scaling off attack. I wonder how much of an impact it's going to be, especially since archers tend to have a higher attack stat than the other units. This is something that troubles me a little bit, but when you look at the overall raw stat blocks that this commander has, even if you take away the only archer units part of this, 30% defense is good, 20% less normal damage, and a 20% chance to negate health and defense buffs on your target. Great. And then dealing 45% increased healing, even if it's not a ton of boost from the overall attack stat, is great. And then debuffing health by up to 50% is a large milestone to cross as well. So while certain commanders will be able to cleanse that in the current meta, it's still something that is great. And then you tack on an expertise that is essentially 25% counterattack damage to rallies and 40% to swarmers. It is potentially one of the most swarm resistant garrisons, which is something that we have needed. So if he really does prove to be a good swarm resistant garrison, he's going to have a solid spot in the meta for a long time. But even if he doesn't, Hera and this commander just really, really gel together well. Just if you look at the kits and the overall bonuses, if you talk about 30% health, you get the health debuff. You get the 20% more skill damage. You get the more normal damage. You get the overall 30% less normal damage taken. You get another 20% on the other side. So really what they do, even though there's technically different damage sources, they definitely beat together very well. And that's something that bodes well for his longevity in the meta. But with that, we will wrap up our discussion. While it's not a certified slam dunk at a glance, I am very much excited to see what this commander is going to do because he has a lot of potential. And just the theory of how he's going to pair with a lot of these commanders is really something to get excited about. But let me know what you think. Do you think he's going to be the next meta staple? Or do you think he's not quite there yet? Let me know in the comments. If you want to see me cover another commander or another topic altogether, let me know down in the comments as well. Or join the Discord using the link in the description and suggest the content there. And as always, good luck, fight well, and I will see you on the battlefield.